Welcome to the Bible reading journey, where we are traveling from Genesis to Revelation in a year. If you have been here before, welcome back. If you're just joining us, welcome to the journey, and just jump in where we are because it's never too late to start. Lighthouse Ministry is happy to be traveling this road with you. Today, we are on day number 82 of the Bible reading journey. Today's reading itinerary is the book of 1 Samuel, chapters 27 through 31. And you'll want to pause here and first dive into today's reading for yourself. Then join us back here for thoughts about today's journey. Today's journey is titled David, the Exiled King-Elect. As usual, in the text notes, there's an outline of 1 Samuel to guide us on our journey. And today we're completing that outline as we are on section 3D of the outline. So we're going to go chapter by chapter today. Chapter 27, David among the Philistines. We start today's reading with an end to the dangerous cat and mouse hunt of Saul and David. David thinks to himself, "Someday Saul is going to get me. The best thing I can do is escape to the Philistines. Then Saul will stop hunting for me in Israelite territory and I will finally be safe." Chapter 27, verse 1. Word soon reached Saul that David had fled to Gath, so he stopped hunting for him. Chapter 27, verse 4. This chapter has some interesting details about how David appears to be defecting from his people in exile, but he is secretly fighting battles for his people, even while in exile. Check out more about that in chapter 27. Chapter 28, Saul consults a medium. Can we say hypocrite? Saul violates God's law and his own law while trying to hide the hypocrisy from the people. Going back to Leviticus 19:31 says, "Do not defile yourselves by turning to mediums or to those who consult the spirit of the dead. I am the Lord your God." And then in today's reading, 1 Samuel 28:3 says, "And Saul banned from the land of Israel all mediums and those who consult the spirit of the dead." Yet, when the Philistines prepared to go to war again with Israel, Saul is gripped with fear. Chapter 28, verse 6, he asked the Lord what he should do, but the Lord refused to answer. So Saul takes matters into his own hands by seeking out a medium to call up the spirit of Samuel. Even the medium knows better, as she says to the disguised Saul, "You know that Saul has outlawed all the mediums and all who consult the spirits of the dead. Why are you setting a trap for me?" Chapter 28, verse 9. She ended up doing what Saul asked, and Saul did not like what he heard. Check out chapter 28 for those details. And then chapter 29, the Philistines reject David. The king of the Philistines required David, who was seeking exile in their land, to fight with them in their war against the Israelites. David was spared from fighting his own nation because the Philistine commanders angrily refused to include David in the battle. You can read those details in chapter 29. Chapter 30, David destroys the Amalekites. David and his men made the 3-day trip to return home after avoiding being forced to fight against their own people in the Philistine war. They arrived home only to find out that the Amalekites had raided their city, burned it to the ground, and captured all the women and children and their possessions. Chapter 30, verses 3 through 4 says, "When David and his men saw the ruins and realized what had happened to their families, they wept until they could weep no more." Then verse 6, David was in great danger because all his men were very bitter about losing their sons and daughters, and they began to talk of stoning him. So what does David do when excruciating personal tragedy hits him and those closest to him? Does he get angry at God? Does he sit back in a victim role, blaming others, maybe even God? Does he take matters into his own hands and do what feels right in the moment? Even if he could justify it, no, he doesn't. Chapter 30, verse 6 tells us, "But David found strength in the Lord his God." David turns to God rather than himself. Verse 8 tells us, "Then David asked the Lord, 'Should I chase after this band of raiders? Will I catch them?' The Lord answered David and was with him." Check out chapter 30 for the rest of that rescue story. And lastly, we have chapter 31, the death of Saul. Meanwhile, the Philistines carried out their war on Israel. They killed 3 of Saul's sons and severely wounded Saul. Saul ended up taking his own life to avoid the Philistines' taunts and torture. Saul lived much of his life taking matters into his own hands, and he died that way too. Again, we can't help but see the contrast of David's willingness to surrender to God's way and Saul's desire to control things his way. Saul believed in God, yet he struggled and succumbed to pride and self-will. Christians are not exempt from battles with sin and temptation. In fact, we will battle it more because we have the Holy Spirit living inside of us, reminding us and telling us about the dangers of our sin nature. The battle rages on because our personal will desires to control things our way. The only answer to the daily battle? All areas of our life must come under the lordship of Jesus Christ. We can win the battles against our own sin nature when we surrender our personal will to Him in all things. The challenge of the day: before we continue shaking our heads at the sinful hypocrite Saul, let us learn from him. Like Saul, do we acknowledge truth outwardly while rebelling against it inwardly? What do we profess in public and do different in private? Bring it under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Let go of control, unlike Saul. Surrender, like David. Don't be the whitewashed tombs described in these verses from Matthew 23:27-28. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. And then let me just remind you of chapter 30, verse 6 to end on a more encouraging note. But David found strength in the Lord his God. The text notes contain information on how to find us on YouTube, Facebook, and email. Happy travels to you today. See you next time. This is Lisa at Lighthouse. God bless.